I want to tell you about the day a man walked into my courtroom with a $320,000 car, a made-to-measure suit, and a lawsuit against a 7-year-old girl, 7 years old. I have been a judge for 22 years. I have seen greed dressed in many costumes. I have seen cruelty with excellent legal representation. But I had never, not once in 2 decades on this bench, looked down at a filing and read the name of a child in the defendant's column. A child who, by every account, had done nothing more dangerous than reach out and touch something beautiful, because she had never seen anything like it in her short, hard, honest little life. The father sat across from me in a blazer that didn't fit. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked every day of his adult life. He was holding a notebook. He had written things in it the night before. Things he believed he needed to say to be believed. He never opened it, because what came out of his mouth when I asked him the one question that changed everything was something no lawyer could have scripted. Something no filing had anticipated. A truth so quiet and so heavy that it silenced every single person in that room, including the man in the made-to-measure suit, who had arrived that morning absolutely certain he already knew how this day was going to end. He was wrong. The father had come into my courtroom terrified. The man with the Ferrari had come in looking for a lesson. Neither of them left the way they came in. If stories about justice, hidden truths, and the moments that remind you what people are actually worth move something in you, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We read every single one. Now let me tell you what really happened in that room. There are cases you carry with you long after the gavel falls. Not the murders, not the frauds, not the men who looked me in the eye and lied with a steadiness that would have impressed a poker champion. Those cases you learn to set down. You develop a kind of professional callousness, not cruelty, just distance. A surgeon doesn't weep over every incision. But then there are the other ones, the ones that arrive on an ordinary Tuesday morning dressed in nothing dramatic, carrying no weapon more dangerous than a piece of paper and a man's unbearable dignity. Those cases don't leave. They become part of the architecture of who you are. They take up permanent residence somewhere behind your sternum. And some nights, when the house is quiet and your coffee has gone cold, you find yourself sitting there with them again. I have been a judge for 22 years. Before that, I spent 11 years as a public defender in a city that had more need for public defenders than it had budget to pay them. I have sat across from addicts, from the desperate, from the genuinely dangerous, and from the genuinely innocent. I have watched the law work exactly as it was designed to work, and I have watched it fail in ways that made me want to hang up my robe and never come back. I did not hang it up. I am still here. But I will tell you this. The case I am about to describe is the one I think about when I try to explain to my grandchildren what justice actually means. Not what the textbooks say it means. What it actually, functionally, humanly means. It happened on a Tuesday in October. The courthouse was running the way old courthouses run on cold mornings, slow and reluctant, like a man who has worked too many years and has earned the right to take his time. The radiators knocked in the walls. The fluorescent light above the clerk's desk had been flickering for 3 weeks and nobody had fixed it. The whole building smelled the way it always smelled. Old paper, burnt coffee from the break room down the hall. And underneath everything, the faint metallic trace of anxiety that seeps into walls over decades of people sitting in uncomfortable chairs, waiting to hear what their lives were worth. I had already handled 2 matters that morning. A landlord-tenant dispute that resolved in 7 minutes. A small claims case involving a fence and a property line that had consumed 2 neighbors' souls for the better part of 18 months. By 10:45, I was ready for the next file, and my clerk, a young woman named Patricia who had been working for me for 4 years and had the best instincts of anyone in that building, slid the folder across my desk before I called for it. She didn't say anything. She just set it down and looked at me with an expression I had learned to read. It meant, "This one is different." I opened it. I read it once. Then I read it again, more slowly. The way you reread something when your brain refuses to accept that the words mean what they clearly mean. Then I took off my glasses, set them on the desk, and pressed my fingers against the bridge of my nose for a long moment. A civil action. Plaintiff, Richard Calloway. Defendant, Marcus Webb, acting as legal guardian of Lily Webb, minor, age 7. Alleged damages, $18,500. Cause, a scratch, approximately 11 centimeters in length, inflicted upon the hood of a Ferrari 488 Spider. Estimated value, $320,000. The scratch, according to the plaintiff's filing, had been caused by the defendant's minor child dragging her finger along the vehicle's surface while unsupervised in a private parking structure. I sat with that for a moment. 7 years old. I put my glasses back on. I stood. I walked out to the courtroom and Patricia called the matter, and the door at the back opened, and I watched the two men enter from opposite directions, as though the room itself had been arranged to show you everything you needed to know before a single word was spoken. Richard Calloway came in from the left. He wore a charcoal suit that had been made for his body specifically. You could tell by the way it moved. His shoes were the kind that make no sound on a floor like that, which is an achievement. His lawyer was beside him, younger, efficient, carrying an aluminum briefcase with the careful energy of someone who had been told this was an important case and intended to perform accordingly. Marcus Webb came in from the right. He was 34 years old, though he looked older that morning. He wore a blazer that had once fit a younger, slightly slimmer version of himself. The kind of blazer that lives at the back of a closet and only comes out for occasions that require the performance of formality, even when formality is beyond your means. His hands were the hands of someone who worked with them for a living, wide across the knuckles, dry at the edges, with the particular stillness of hands that have held tools for so many hours they forget how to simply rest. He was carrying a small spiral notebook. He had written things in it, I could see, in careful block letters, notes probably of what he intended to say. What he believed he needed to say to be believed. He sat down. He placed the notebook on the table in front of him. He looked at it instead of at me, and I thought, I know this man. Not personally, but I knew what he was carrying into this room. I had seen it on 100 faces in 22 years. It was the specific weight of a person who has done nothing wrong and is terrified that it will not matter. 11:06. The fluorescent light above the clerk's desk flickered once, twice, then held. I called the room to order. The sound of the gavel in that space, a sound I have produced thousands of times in my career, has never become routine to me. People think it would. They imagine that repetition drains meaning from ritual. But every time that wood meets wood, I feel the room change. The air shifts. Conversations die mid-syllable. People who were looking at their phones look up. Something ancient and serious moves through the space. A reminder that what happens here is not ordinary. That words spoken here carry weight that words spoken elsewhere do not. The room settled. I looked at the plaintiff's attorney first. He was already on his feet, which told me something about the kind of lawyer he was. The kind who had been taught that motion communicates confidence. He introduced himself. He introduced his client. He used the word egregious in his opening sentence, which is a word that courtrooms hear often, and that has been so thoroughly laundered of meaning by overuse that it lands now with approximately the force of a damp tissue. He presented the documentation with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times and expected it to be over quickly. The laude from the repair shop, the photographic evidence, the estimated cost of restoration, the legal precedent establishing parental liability for damages caused by minor children. He stacked it all on the table between us like a man laying down cards he was certain would win the hand. $18,500. He said the number cleanly, without drama, the way you say a number when you want it to sound inevitable rather than obscene. I looked at Marcus Webb while the attorney spoke. He was looking at the table. His jaw was tight. His right hand rested on top of the spiral notebook, and his fingers were pressed flat against it, the way a person presses their hand against something to keep themselves from reaching for it. He had prepared what he wanted to say. He had written it down in careful letters. And now he was sitting here listening to a man in a made-to-measure suit build a wall out of documents and legal citations. And I watched him understand, slowly, with the particular devastation of the unprepared facing the prepared, that his notebook was not going to be enough. The attorney finished. He sat down. He straightened his tie. I let the silence hold for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then I looked at Richard Calloway directly for the first time. He met my eyes without hesitation. There was something in his expression that I have encountered before in men of his particular variety of wealth. Not arrogance exactly, though arrogance was certainly present. It was more than that. It was the settled bedrock certainty of a man who has moved through the world for so long with money clearing the path ahead of him that he has genuinely forgotten the path requires clearing. He looked at me the way people look at a process they expect to complete on schedule. He was not nervous. He had no reason in his estimation to be nervous. He had the documents. He had the lawyer. He had the law. What he had, in other words, was everything except the point. I picked up the filing and read the central allegation aloud for the record. A 7-year-old child, a finger dragged across the hood of an automobile, 11 centimeters, $18,500. The court reporter's fingers moved steadily across her machine. I set the filing down. Mr. Calloway, I said, your documentation states that you declined the defendant's offer to arrange a payment plan for the damages. Is that accurate? His attorney leaned forward slightly, but Calloway answered before the man could intervene. That's correct, Your Honor. Can you tell me why? There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough. Because accepting a payment arrangement wasn't the appropriate response to the situation, he said. There need to be consequences. People need to understand that property has value, and that value needs to be respected. If I'd accepted his offer, there's no lesson learned. I wrote nothing down. I simply looked at him. A lesson, he had said. He had brought a 7-year-old girl's father into a courtroom without legal representation to teach him a lesson. I turned to Marcus Webb. He looked up when I said his name. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has not been sleeping well for a long time. Not the acute red of a single sleepless night, but the deeper, structural fatigue of someone for whom rest has become a concept rather than a reality. Mr. Webb, I said, and I kept my voice exactly as level as I keep it for everyone, because the courtroom is not a place where my sympathies belong to any one person before the facts are on the table. You've heard the allegation. You've heard the documentation. I'm going to ask you something now, and I want you to take whatever time you need to answer it. He nodded. I leaned forward slightly. Why, I said, were you and your daughter in that parking structure on the afternoon in question? The fluorescent light flickered again. The court reporter's machine went still. Marcus Webb looked down at his notebook. Then he looked back up at me, and I watched something happen in his face. Not a collapse, not a breakdown, but a kind of quiet surrender to honesty, the way a person looks when they have decided that pretense costs more than they can afford. He opened his mouth, and the room, without anyone asking it to, went completely silent. He didn't reach for the notebook. Whatever he had written in it, whatever careful sequence of facts he had assembled in his kitchen the night before, sitting under a lamp that probably needed a new bulb, trying to construct a defense out of plain language and good intentions, he left it on the table. He looked at me instead. And he spoke the way people speak when they have run out of the energy required to be anything other than honest. I was working, he said. There's a building on Hargrove Street. Torres del Sol. They were rewiring the 14th floor. It was a 3-day job. That was day 2. I nodded. I said nothing. There is a specific kind of silence that invites a person to continue, and I have spent 22 years learning how to hold it. My mother was supposed to watch Lily. She watches both my kids most days when school's not in session. But that morning, early around 5:30, she called me from the hospital. She'd fallen the night before. Her hip. They were taking her into surgery at 7. He paused. She's 71. The room held its breath. I couldn't find anyone else. My neighbor works nights. She was sleeping. The woman from Lily's school who sometimes helps out, she wasn't answering. I called 4 people. He stopped, looked at his hands. I know I shouldn't have brought her to a job site, I know that. But I couldn't not go to work. I don't get paid if I don't show up. There's no sick leave, there's no... He stopped himself, started again. I have 2 kids. Noah's 9, Lily's 7. It's just me. I let that sentence exist in the room for a moment without rushing past it. It's just me. 3 words, 11 letters. The entire weight of a life compressed into a grammatical unit so small you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. Lily stayed in the lobby, he continued. The security guard, a man named Earl, he said he'd keep an eye on her. She had her backpack with her, her coloring books, some crackers. She was fine. She's a good kid. His voice caught briefly on something he chose not to release in this room. She's a really good kid. What happened to Earl? I asked. Lunch break. He was gone maybe 5 minutes. He told me later he felt terrible about it. Marcus shook his head slightly. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't... Lily didn't do anything wrong either. She saw the car and she went to look at it. She's 7. It was red and shiny and it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen in her life. Something moved across his face then. Brief and complicated. Equal parts sorrow and something that was almost a father's helpless pride. She told me she thought it was a toy. A giant toy. She said it looked like it was from a movie. The silence in the room had changed quality. I have presided over enough proceedings to know the difference between a silence that is waiting and a silence that has arrived somewhere. This one had arrived. I did not look at Richard Calloway. Not yet. Mr. Webb, I said. When Mr. Calloway's representative contacted you about the damage, what happened? I went down to look at the scratch myself. It was there, I'm not disputing that. It was a scratch. About this long. He held up his hands, indicating a length that in any other context would have been entirely unremarkable. I told him I was sorry. I told Lily to apologize, and she did. She cried. She didn't fully understand what she'd done wrong, but she knew the man was angry and she cried. He pressed his lips together. I offered to pay. I said it would take me time, but I would pay every dollar. I asked if we could work something out. And his response? Marcus Webb looked at the table for a moment. He said that a payment plan wasn't good enough, that what I needed was to understand that actions have consequences, that I needed to feel it. He looked up. And then a week later I got served with the lawsuit. I wrote 1 line on the pad in front of me. I write things down not always because I need to remember them, but because the act of writing gives me a moment to make sure what I am about to say is what I actually mean. Then I set the pen down. I took off my glasses, and I did something I rarely do in active proceedings. I stood up, not to leave, not to signal a recess. I stood because what I needed to say next required me to be standing, the way certain truths require more of your body than sitting allows. I looked at Richard Calloway for a long time. He met my eyes. His expression had shifted almost imperceptibly from certainty to something adjacent to caution. He was reading the room. The way intelligent men do when the room begins to feel different than they expected. He was recalibrating. It was too late to recalibrate. Mr. Calloway, I said, I have listened carefully to everything presented in this courtroom today. I have reviewed your documentation. Your damages are real. Your legal standing to pursue this action is technically sound. I want to acknowledge that before I say what I am about to say. Because I believe in intellectual honesty, and intellectual honesty requires me to give you what is yours before I take it back." His attorney had gone very still. "But I have also listened to this man." I gestured toward Marcus Webb without looking at him. "And I have heard something that your filing did not include and that your attorney did not address. I heard about a woman in surgery at 7 in the morning. I heard about 4 phone calls that went unanswered. I heard about a child with coloring books and crackers in a lobby, waiting for her father to finish work so they could go home. I heard about a scratch 11 centimeters long on a car worth $320,000. Made by a 7-year-old girl who thought she had found the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. I let that land. You told this court that you came here because people need to understand that property has value." I paused. "Mr. Calloway, I have been in this building for 22 years. I have watched property be valued and I have watched people be valued. And I can tell you with the full authority of everything I have witnessed in this room that you have confused the two. You do not have an $18,000 problem. You have a perspective problem. And unfortunately for you, only one of those is something I can rule on today." I picked up the gavel. "This action is found entirely without merit. Judgment for the defendant. Case dismissed." The sound of the gavel, that specific, final, irrevocable sound, hit the air like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Richard Calloway's attorney put his pen down slowly. Richard Calloway said nothing. And Marcus Webb, who had been holding himself together with everything he had from the moment he walked through that door, put his face in his hands and his shoulders began to shake. And the sound that came from him was not quite crying and not quite breathing, and was exactly the sound a person makes when something they were braced to lose turns out to still be theirs. I did not look away from him. I am not ashamed to tell you that I did not look away. 11:10. Some cases end when the gavel falls. This one was just beginning. I have learned, over the course of a long career in these rooms, that the moment a proceeding concludes is rarely the moment the story concludes. The law operates on schedules. Life does not. What happens inside a courtroom takes 20 minutes or 2 hours. What happens because of it can take years to fully arrive. Years of consequences, of reversals, of the slow, grinding work of things becoming what they were always meant to be, or failing to. I did not know, when I walked back to my chambers that Tuesday in October, what would follow. I knew only what I had seen. A man who had come in carrying more than any human being should have to carry alone, and who had left carrying slightly less of it. That is not nothing. In 22 years, I have learned to measure justice in units smaller than vindication. Sometimes it is simply the act of being heard. Sometimes it is a stranger in a robe looking at you across a room and saying, without ambiguity, "I see what this is." And it is not what they said it was. I went back to my desk. Patricia brought me coffee. The flickering light in the hallway had improbably stopped flickering. The afternoon moved on. But the case did not stay inside that building. Within 48 hours, a recording of the proceedings, made by a local journalist who had been in the back of the courtroom covering an unrelated matter, had been posted online. I was not aware of this immediately. I am not a man who monitors his own appearances on the internet, partly from preference and partly from a practical understanding that a judge who reads his own press becomes, over time, a judge who performs for his own press, and that is a corruption I have always been determined to resist. But Patricia told me. She came into my chambers on Thursday morning with her phone turned outward and a look on her face that was trying very hard to be professional and not quite succeeding. The video had been watched at that point 4 million times. By the end of the week, it was 11 million. I want to be careful here about what I say, because I am aware that what I did in that courtroom was not extraordinary. It was the minimum. It was what the room required. A child scratched a car. A father offered to pay. A wealthy man chose punishment over resolution. The law, applied correctly and humanely, had only one possible answer. I did not perform an act of heroism. I performed an act of basic decency. and the fact that 11 million people found it remarkable enough to share with one another says something about the world that I do not have the energy to fully unpack in these pages. But that keeps me awake some nights in ways I have not entirely made peace with. What I can tell you is what happened next. Richard Calloway did not appeal. I do not know whether this was the advice of his attorney, the counsel of his own better instincts, or simply the recognition that a man who has already become the villain of 11 million people's Tuesday afternoon has little to gain from a second act. His company, a mid-sized construction firm that had built its reputation partly on high-end residential contracts, began losing clients within 10 days of the video's circulation. 3 significant contracts were quietly withdrawn. A charitable foundation whose board he sat on accepted his resignation. I heard these things the way you hear things in a small legal community, through the careful second-hand channels of professional gossip, which I neither seek out nor entirely discourage. I do not take pleasure in reporting this. I want to be precise about that. What happened to Richard Calloway's professional standing was not justice. It was consequence, which is a different thing. Justice had already occurred in that courtroom on a Tuesday morning. What followed was the world, in its imprecise and sometimes disproportionate way, continuing to respond. I hope, and I genuinely mean this, that somewhere in the months that followed, Richard Calloway sat alone with himself long enough to ask the question that the courtroom had implicitly posed to him, and that no one can answer on another man's behalf. I hope he answered it honestly. As for Marcus Webb, a legal aid organization contacted him within a week of the video's release, offering pro bono representation for any future matters and a review of his current financial situation. A community fund, organized by people who had watched the video and felt the specific, galvanizing anger of witnessing something unjust, raised enough money to cover 3 months of his rent and a portion of his mother's medical bills. I know this because Marcus Webb wrote me a letter. It arrived 6 weeks after the case. 3 pages, handwritten, on lined paper that had been torn carefully from a spiral notebook. The same notebook, I suspected, that he had brought to the courtroom and never opened. He wrote about his mother's recovery, slow but progressing. He wrote about Noah, who had apparently decided he wanted to be a lawyer after his father told him what had happened in that courtroom. He wrote about Lily, who had asked him several times whether the man with the nice car was still angry at her, and to whom he had said each time that no, the man was not angry anymore, and that a very kind judge had made everything okay. He wrote that last part, and then he wrote, I don't know if judges are allowed to receive thank you letters. I don't know if this will even reach you, but I needed to write it anyway, because you looked at me in that room like I was worth looking at, and I had not felt that way in a long time, and I think that mattered more than the verdict. I read that letter twice. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer of my desk where I keep the things I return to. I have returned to it several times since. There is a version of this story that is about the law, about liability and precedent and the technical architecture of civil procedure. That version is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not go very far. The version I carry with me is simpler and harder to articulate in legal language. It is about a man who showed up to a place designed to make him feel small and left it standing. It is about a child who dragged her finger across something beautiful because she had never seen anything like it and wanted to know if it was real. It is about the difference between the price of something and the value of something, and about how easily, how dangerously easily, those two concepts get confused by people who have had the luxury of never needing to distinguish between them. Every morning I put on this robe. I try to remember that the people who come through that door are not cases. They are not files or docket numbers or line items on a court calendar. They are people who have arrived at a point in their lives where they need someone to look at them clearly and tell them the truth about what they are worth. That is the job. Not the gavel, not the robe, not the citations and the precedents and the procedural architecture we have built up over centuries to give our decisions the appearance of inevitability. The job is to look at a man standing in front of you with a too-tight blazer and a notebook full of words he was afraid to say, and to make sure that when he leaves, he knows that the truth of who he is was never in question. Not for a single moment. Not in this room. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Marcus or Lily, or the 11 centimeters that somehow became about something much larger than 11 centimeters, then you already understand what this channel is about. We are not here for the sensational. We are not here for the verdict alone. We are here for the moment just before the verdict, when a person is still uncertain whether the world is going to see them clearly. We are here for that moment every single time, because it matters every single time. If you believe that too, subscribe. Leave a comment. Tell me which part of this case stayed with you. And come back next time, because I promise you, the next story is already waiting, and it is going to need you to hear it. If this story stayed with you, stop for just a moment and ask yourself something honest. Have you ever been the person in the room with the notebook, the one who prepared everything, who showed up with everything they had, and still felt like the walls were closing in before anyone had heard a single word? Have you ever watched someone confuse the price of a thing with the value of a person, and felt, somewhere deep and wordless, that you were the person being priced? And have you ever been surprised, genuinely, quietly surprised, by the moment the world looked at you clearly and told you the truth about what you were worth? Leave that in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about dignity, about justice, and about the kind of compassion that costs nothing and means everything, subscribe to this channel. The next story is already waiting, and it needs you to hear it.